The 540 is brought to you by StarCityGames.com's weekly sale. Head over to StarCityGames.com/sale and check out our variant sale. Not a variance sale, a variant sale. From now until Sunday, January 23rd at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, you can save 15% on all variant Magic the Gathering cards. That's going to be things like showcase cards, your Fairy Tale Frame and Throne of Eldraine, for example, all those alternate versions of cards that you find in collector boosters. So if you've been waiting on buying some variant versions of cards for your cube or your collection, the time to buy is now, and the place is at StarCityGames.com/sale.
The 540 is brought to you by Coalesce Apparel and Design. Go to coalesceapparel.shop for the coolest MTG apparel out there. From shirts to hoodies to stickers, they got you. Save 10% at checkout with gift code SCG. Hate mulliganing? Me too. Join me as part of the Anti-Mulligan Mulligan Club. Think math is for blockers? Rep the alphas at Attack University. And don't forget to save 10% at checkout with gift code SCG. Coalesce Apparel and Design. No one made what they wanted, so they made it themselves.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting week of Cube Conversation here on the 540, brought to you by StarCityGames.com. I am Ryan Overturf. You can find me at Ryan Overdrive on Twitter. Once again, I will be joined this week by Ryan Saxe.
Hey, everybody, I'm Ryan Saxe, and you can find me at RC Saxe on Twitter.
Off to a great start here. We do have a fun topic this week, and this is something that you pitched a little maybe a week or two ago, and I thought it was a pretty cool topic, and it actually relates a lot to what this week has looked like for me in terms of Cube. The Supreme Draft Vintage Cube has been up on Magic Online this week, and I have been tearing through the queues like a maniac. It's a 1 week run, went up Wednesday. I have 10 trophies, and I have just kind of been jumping back into the queue every time I finish a draft. I'm not the trophy leader, but I'm in like 5th place right now.
Sweet. Now, it's singleton this time, right? Kind of.
Yeah, it's weird because before Supreme Draft would be like you get a pack that's from a totally different version of the cube, so you could see the same cards over and over again. They haven't made a public statement about it, but for whatever reason, that's how it worked before. This run, you are literally drafting half of the cube. You're not seeing any duplicate in packs. Every pack is unique. So it's sort of this really weird build your deck 2 cards at a time, a vintage 40 card constructed format.
Yeah.
Which is very different from the Supreme Draft where you could have, 4 Black Lotus or whatever, multiple pieces of the assorted parts of the Power 9. And just trying to win on turn 1 at any cost. There is certainly some winning on turn 1 at any cost, though. You have way more of a puncher's chance. Matter of fact, turn 1, a Library of Alexandria has won more games than I've seen it lose in this format. It's a little bit more tame, pushes you more in the card advantage direction, even if the card advantage engines are completely broken in their own right.
Yeah, I mean, you're playing with the best cards ever, and you really get your choosing of them. It's a pretty crazy format. I haven't played it this time around. I think I've mentioned it wasn't really my shtick the last time around. I enjoyed it a lot once or twice, but I kind of felt, at least for me, I felt if I was plowing through it, it was like eating my whole bag of Halloween candy on on Halloween, like not even waiting till the next morning. Which, to be fair, as a kid, I certainly tried to do.
Right. It was kind of physically impossible then in terms of just how much candy there is. You just ran out of appetite. You just can't eat that much. Now, and as an adult, it's more like you have several pieces of candy and you start feeling like garbage, even though you could eat more actual food. But that is really relevant to this week's topic. And the Supreme Draft is super polarizing. I love it. It's maybe not for you. It's not for all of my friends. And this week we are talking about joyful cube drafting. We're talking about how to approach cube in the way that you will personally enjoy the experience, which obviously is incredibly subjective.
Not as subjective as it gets.
We're not busting out a checklist. This isn't do all these things and you'll have fun, because that's not how fun works. But this is two people who are very experienced in drafting cubes, building cubes, playing other people's cubes, and figuring out how to approach these formats that can be high variance. Some are lower variance, just taking just a cube and approaching it and trying to have fun the way that you could enjoy it. For me, my perspective is really like a recovering spike tournament grinder type. So a lot of my perspective is about trying to draft decks that have a good shot of winning. And so that's going to be a lot of the notes that will be referencing from my personal experience. I'm going to try to make these notes broader, that they fit more people's perspective, more casually minded gamers. And I'm going to, try to finesse my perspective, as well as, illuminate my biases and tell you what works for me and how you might tweak things if that is not your approach. What's your perspective on this sort of thing, Ryan?
I really kind of go all over the place with it. The funny thing, so I mean, I'm also quite competitive, and to me, if I draft a deck that like literally like there's no hope of possibly winning with it. Like we I don't know, maybe we haven't all been there. Fanatics like me have all been there, where you draft a Storm deck and at the end you go like, it is literally not possible for me to like, I am actually just going to drop and draft again because I have to 0-3. Like I can't possibly not. And that I don't find particularly, fun. But I don't feel like I need to roll everybody at the table. For me, fun is about sort of just a few things. One, there are just certain cards that I love casting, and being able to draft a deck that not specifically just has it, but leverages the card really well makes me happy. An example of a card like that is Bloodbraid Elf. What's really funny about that is, people who know me, is generally I like to be as lean as possible. We're talking the mono red aggressive decks that would never touch a green splash for a Bloodbraid Elf, even if the green was free, like that low to the ground, or combo decks that also really have no interest in Bloodbraid Elf. Those are like generally my go-to spike way of enjoying cube. But Bloodbraid Elf is one of the first cards I ever owned 4 copies of and played with, and it makes my heart happy. And so it turns out, and I learned this not from drafting into my own cube, I love drafting Jund Delirium type decks that'll love taking advantage of just the value in Bloodbraid Elf. And that's like the last kind of Magic that I usually enjoy. So really sitting back and I think reflecting on who you are, the different ways that you've interacted with Magic, the different ways that I've interacted with Magic, and seeing how you can have the most fun experience for you, how you can draft with your own preferences in mind to find sort of the intersection of joy as well as winning, particularly because usually joy and winning are related. But I'd take a step back from, at least for me personally, from the way that you've sort of identified about winning being sort of at the forefront. It's something that increases my enjoyment. And as long as my deck can function, I'm not so worried about that as I am sort of the general experience of how the deck makes me feel.
Yeah, and I do largely relate to that. It so happens that a lot of the cards that I really like tend to be the most powerful cards.
Sure.
Not all of them. I've drawn the line in the sand time and again. I don't like Oko, Thief of Crowns. I don't pass it, pack one, pick one, but I won't go out of my way to go into a second color for it. And I'll try to justify it where if a friend is watching me draft, I'll say, well, if I draft the Oko, then I need to get Tropical Island. But really, the crux of the issue is I don't want to play the Oko in the first place.
Right.
And when you initially pitched this topic, it was kind of funny. That same day, this was when the regular Vintage Cube was on Magic Online before the Supreme Drafts. I was watching a friend draft, and I'm not really the type to suggest a line. I am the type to critique or tease a friend after the fact. This wasn't something that I teased my friend for because he's just there trying to have a fun time. I would have teased somebody who tried to suggest that the decision I'm about to describe was correct in terms of objectively trying to win matches, but he opens a pretty weak pack outside of the fact that it has Library of Alexandria, where to me it was pretty open and shut. That's an easy pack one, pick one. And he hems and haws for a while, and he ends up picking Through the Breach. And after that pick, I asked him, what's the most powerful card that you would pass in order to draft Through the Breach? Because I was trying to kind of hide what I was really getting at and not be too explicit about, I think this pick is very bad. And he says, oh, I don't really have an answer for that. And I said, oh, well, I was just trying to get at whether Library of Alexandria was the literal answer to that question. And he says, oh, I just don't like the play patterns of Library. I don't think that card is fun. I don't want to play with that card. And that position is totally respectable.
100%.
Like, I will rag on people. I keep seeing Library like 5th pick in this last run of the Vintage Cube on Magic Online, which is egregious. Like, there is no way objectively trying to win that many people can pass that card and be correct.
There's a reason that people call Library of Alexandria Leyline of the Win.
Yes. Yeah, that card shows up on turn 1. Forget about it. The game is often over before it starts. But if you want to have fun, Through the Breach, my position on that, I won't even go into how I feel about that card because that's not really relevant. It's just clearly much, much worse than Library of Alexandria. But if you want to have a fun time, it is a card that you know what you're trying to do with it. You assemble some giant Annihilating Eldrazi or something like Gristlebrand, and you get a deck that when you cast that spell, it will fairly often close the game. It's not like some mid-range 4 or 5 mana card over Library. It is at least trying to do something that is kind of sweet. Like, some people really love Through the Breach. And in fact, like, from a Vorthos perspective, that I think it was Ultimate Masters Through the Breach that actually has Emrakul in the art. It's like an incredibly cool thing.
Yep.
So there's just so many different ways to appreciate Magic. And that he went on to draft a deck. I think it was like a 2-1, but it was a coherent deck that was trying to do something. And I think that as long as you are trying to actually do something and engage with the game in a way that you find fun, you can't be wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest questions, one of the biggest differences between normal, limited, and even constructed and cube is just there's a plethora of lanes of paths at your disposal. Something that I think, people don't really realize. You see this in sort of like a lot of people when they design their first cube, they're trying to focus on 2-color archetypes, right? And I mean, if I were to ask you, like, how many archetypes are in your cube? I don't know an answer. If you ask me, it's got to, I don't know, 50, 100, 200. I mean, the amount of different ways that you can piece cards together. I mean, it's like art. It's beautiful. There's just so many different things that you can do. So many small perturbations of your deck that can take the same color combination and create massively different strategies. And as long as you sort of know those paths, know what you're doing, you can sort of pave your own lane and do something awesome. Through the Breach is a great example of, any red deck can do that, and they all do it in their own separate way. I mean, you usually see it best in, black to pair with Reanimator spells, or blue because blue is blue. But I've had sweet, like, red-green stompy decks that still played some, like, big things at the top of the curve and Through the Breach, because you could also just Through the Breach an Inferno Titan, and that's also fine.
Yeah, there's definitely a range. Your deck doesn't even have to, literally be looking for Emrakul. There's a bunch of different ways to build with that in mind. And that's going to be a matter of preference too, like kind of a meaty, not super giant cheaty deck.
Yeah.
Inferno Titan can win a lot of games.
Oh, yeah.
You don't need to go all the way up to 15 to do that sort of thing with the big creature cheat strategies. I think another really good example of approaching cube draft in a joyful way for me is, well, it's kind of a be like a weird pivot to the opposite, but like I hate Splinter Twin. Like I just do not like having that in my draft deck, because for me, it's this sort of thing where certainly, at least for my blue decks and vintage cubes, I'm trying to draft high agency decks. I like taking a turn where it feels like what is highlighted, what's at the forefront is the decision that I make, leaving up a counter, what modes I'm choosing on Cryptic Command, how I navigate my Mystic Confluence, where my opponent has a little bit of time to set up, and how I pick that apart and then try to turn the corner very meticulously. I enjoy that sort of thing. Where Splinter Twin, I personally feel like I'm at the mercy at the top of my deck. Like either I drew the combo or I didn't, and then sometimes I do, and the opponent just has like the kill spell, and I want to be sideboarding into the deck that I enjoy more in the first place anyway, if I feel like the combo is bad in the matchup. However, if I watch somebody draft and they just like pack one, pick one Splinter Twin, I can't say that that's wrong. It's very powerful, and some people really love it. And that's compounded also by the fact that it's just not legal or good in any constructed formats anymore.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that reminds me of is you can ask yourself a really interesting question when you're drafting. I'm actually a huge fan of this. I think it's something that many players can benefit from, is just like an internal dialogue where you ask yourself questions about the deck that you're currently drafting to just sort of help you walk down that path. I imagine, if you ask yourself the question, am I having fun if my deck does what it's supposed to do? And the answer is no. Why are you drafting that deck? It doesn't matter if it's powerful, right? Like Splinter Twin's a really great example of this, where I know many people, and it sounds like you're probably one of them. If you go like end step Pestermite, untap Twin, are you having fun?
If it works, but that's the problem. I'm not having any fun approaching the decision. It's literally just win, yes or no. So I'm not having any fun unique to the deck.
Right.
At which
your fun comes from winning.
A joyless exercise anyway.
Right. Playing the deck is not the fun part. You're like, okay, yeah, I won. That's kind of fun. And I mean, I personally, I do actually really like playing with the play patterns of Splinter Twin. One of the things that I find really unique about Splinter Twin that I enjoy is branching outside of blue-red for unique scenarios and particular ways of insulating against your deck being one-dimensional to give other avenues of ways to use Splinter Twin, convert yourself into a mid-range deck, and win in a more fair way when you can't execute your combo. I find that like really compelling and engaging during the draft and gameplay. But I definitely don't find you just have twin pieces, you just have cantrips interaction compelling. So actually something that you'll find I do when I'm drafting, and this is absolutely motivated by fun, not by what's correct. I take Kiki Jiki over Splinter Twin. It is certainly worse, but I would rather have a deck that's trying to sort of push Kiki Jiki's limits, whether that's reanimating the Kiki Jiki itself, whether that's something like Kiki Pod. But so what that basically means to me is I'm more likely to pass a pick one Splinter Twin, even though it's better, than I am to pass a pick one Kiki Jiki.
Yeah, I have a friend who is really into Kiki Jiki Eternal Witness Time Walk. Yeah. And that totally rules. You can't blame him for that. And ever since we did the deep dive here on the show about Kitchen Finks Persist combo, I have had kind of an earworm. I have been losing sleep trying to put together a cube that has Birthing Pod, like a Kiki Pod archetype, because that just sounds really fun to me. You know,
the best deck that I've ever drafted in my cube, it went, I think I played everybody. It might have gone like 8-0, 16-0 kind of thing. Or wherever it was. It was a long day we were playing. It was a mono blue Kiki Pod deck. I had like other, mana sources and like a bunch of like mana rocks to help sort of cast off color creatures. But it was the best pod chain deck that I ever had, backed up by like a ton of blue interaction. It was awesome. almost any, if you gave me any two creatures of any like mana costs on the board, I could win if I had pod.
Nice. Just like a bunch of ways to untap pod, or
because there was, it was the classic sort of, you have like your suite of clones. I think I had like Phantasmal Image, both Kiki, both Deceiver and Pestermite, Resto, Zealous Conscripts. and probably also Phyrexian Metamorph. And so there's just so many ways of, just getting through all the way to, Kiki plus one of those things.
That's really cool. And that's what we're talking about this weekend. We're trying to draft cool decks that we'll enjoy. And this is going to come down to, of course, your personal subjective preferences. However, I know that when it comes to trying to draft something kind of off the walls or off the radar in a cube, it is still important. Certainly, if you have a perspective like mine, where you do value winning, whether that be because you enjoy winning, you hate losing, or you're playing on one of the digital platforms and playing ain't free, trying to win makes a lot of sense to me. So our next section on this week's show is going to be about kind of preparing yourself to build a good version of what you enjoy. Just being mindful of trying to get some good equity while also, in terms of winning, while also trying to get equity in terms of joy, if you will. And then we are going to kind of go more broadly into just how to approach drafting what you enjoy once you identify, what's going on in Cube. How can I kind of maximize navigating environments like this? And then what are the metagame considerations? How do I put together something I can really enjoy playing? We're going to take our first commercial break here, and then we'll be back to talk about knowing the Cube.
Hello there from Dominario's Judgment, a weekly podcast for Star City Games with me, Dom Harvey.
And me, Ari Lex.
Where we bring you the latest, greatest, and downright weirdest things Modern has to offer.
Want to know what to expect for next weekend's events? We've got you covered.
Do you want deep breakdowns of the hot topics and decks in Modern? We've got you covered.
Just want to make sure you don't miss the latest nonsense before your opponents teach you a lesson about it in the queues? Oh yeah, we have definitely got you covered. Find us every week on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Or if you want to head over to StarCityGames.com, we'll be right there alongside all the great content from all your other favorite content producers.
All right, welcome back, everyone. It's time to get into how we approach joyful cube drafting. I'll reiterate that for me, a recovering spike, I do still care a lot about winning when I draft my decks. I really want to try to draft something coherent, something powerful, something that has good fundamentals. And not everyone's going to be like me in that regard. And at least as far as the advice, quote unquote, advice people would offer to me back when I used to stream on Twitch, people like suggesting stuff that are cards that are too expensive, you won't realistically cast, that just don't make sense in the deck that you're drafting. And for a lot of people, like having some kind of wacky plan that works one time out of 100, the possibility that it might work is just enough. And honestly, if that's enough for you, like, it might not be that valuable to listen to this conversation. I don't want to turn you off of the product, but like, if you can just do whatever and be fine, I'm a little jealous of you. Like, it would be refreshing, I think, to be able to just draft something horrible in 03 and never have my plan work. I'm just not the kind of person that could be happy doing that sort of thing every draft. For me, I think it's really important. And this is because of the written medium, my articles in Star City Games, when I break down the spotlight cubes, I try to identify the most powerful cards by color and then usually frame those in terms of the archetypes that I would try to draft. And that is just kind of like level one. If I want to win, having these cards in my deck, drafting these decks, these make sense to me as the most powerful thing. And as I try to do some combination of win and see what's going on with the other decks, and also confirm or refute my hypotheses, I will largely stick to those. But when it comes to like draft 3, I'm at the point where I'm trying to figure out, for me, it's going to be the is it win eventually style deck. Yeah, that's what I really enjoy playing in most formats. I will tend to pivot towards just trying to play what I like the most. But the step one for me very much is kind of identifying what are the best things. Because when it comes to pack one, pick one, like I said at the top of the show, I don't really have interest in passing Oko when it's obviously the most powerful card in the pack. And, if you have it in you to pick through the breach over the Library of Alexandria, I think you should continue doing that. That's just not in my range.
I mean, it's a hard thing to do because when you it's wrong, right? You have to sit there and actually, do something that is wrong.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've done with Cube that I think is interesting is generally, right. Again, I still sort of want to win when I play, and there's sort of these suite of like very good cards that I've learned that there are ways that you can intersect the already existing good cards with like cards that are not of the same caliber that do fun things. I'll give an example. In my personal Cube, I really like the card Kefnet, not the Mindful. It's the one that's the 4-mana 4/5. I don't know. Kefnet something.
Is
Eternal
it
God?
God Eternal?
God Eternal Kefnet. There it is. All right. Teamwork. So that card, it's a 4-mana 4/5 flyer. It can't really die. Like it goes to the top of your library, or I think tucked like the third card in your library.
Third from the top, I want to say.
And basically, whenever you would draw your first card each turn, if it's an instant or sorcery, you can reveal it and then cast a copy of it that costs 2 less. Okay, so the card still goes into your hand, but you're able to sort of like effectively get to cast it twice, right? You can cast the copy and the card still goes into your hand. It's like a good example of like a good rate Magic card that kind of falls behind for most blue sections in like a vintage Cube, because it's a 4-mana sorcery speed creature.
Right.
Which is not what you're doing with most of your blue decks, even though it's like a 4-mana 4/5 flyer that's hard to kill with massive upside. I love it in my Cube, and I've noticed like it makes me enjoy, like I used to just like really not enjoy cards like Jace the Mind Sculptor. Just like it is what that card is a good Magic card, and that is it. There is nothing else to that card. It's not even like in Cube, I don't even think Jace is broken. It's not. It's just a good card. But it's a very good card, and that's the only thing that it does. And so, I accidentally, I had Kefnet in my Cube just because this was when, I was testing Kefnet the first time. I ended up with like a blue deck that had Kefnet, Jace, and a Time Warp, and I like accidentally took infinite turns. It was not my intention, but the repeatable brainstorm. And so like then I was like, oh, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to re-add Scroll Rack to my Cube, because that can also be paired with Kefnet. And I started to, I realized like before that point, I just wouldn't pick one of Jace the Mind Sculptor. I just wouldn't do it. I'll get into blue for other reasons, but I never felt like I missed Jace in terms of my enjoyment, even if, it would bolster the win rate of the deck. And I found myself picking Jace more simply because Jace would get me excited about, Time Warp and Kefnet. And if I didn't get the Kefnet and I just had a Jace and a Time Warp, is that a bad thing? Probably not. And it was a way of, making me smile more without really sacrificing much, right? I got to do something that I found fun and unique. But I was also just taking the best card out of the pack at the beginning of a draft.
You just actually reminded me of a really common experience. So before Supreme Draft was live on Magic Online, we had 3 weeks of traditional booster draft for the Vintage Cube. And there gets to be a point, and it's particularly for me if I like have been 2-1ing with a bunch of blue decks in a row. If I'm winning, I'll just keep doing whatever. But if I'm like breaking even constantly and I keep playing blue decks and the games are long and it's just like, I'm just gonna keep winning my 60% and just passing the turn with mana up, I'm kind of bored of this. And you get to that draft number 3 of the day and just a deep sigh at a pack where Jace, for example, Jace the Mind Sculptor is obviously the best card in the pack. And it's just like, am I really going to do this again? And then just like Windmill Slam, Monastery Swift Spear. Like
Hell
that's
yeah.
the palate cleanser for me. I'm just like, okay, listen, I've been 2-1ing with blue cards too much. I might 0-3 with this red deck, but at least I'll feel something.
And look, all of us are here to feel something at the end of the day. Most of the time that comes through winning, but it can come through other avenues. I'll say one of the archetypes that I love the most in my Cube or any Cube that supports it is black aggro. And I'll often do sort of something similar where I open a pack and the best card is certainly not Gravecrawler. But I wanted to, but I'm going to take the Gravecrawler. And that's certainly less advised in terms of winning than something like Monastery Swiftspear or Goblin Guide, unless you do what I do a lot, which is, pack one, pick one, you take a Thoughtseize, Inquisition, or a Duress solely because I'm not taking those because they're the best card in the pack. They're usually not, but they're usually, let's say top 3 or something. It's premium interaction that can interact with combo decks, which is important in high-powered cubes. I'm taking them because there's a black 1-drop that I know nobody else at this table is going to take, unless I look to my left and see Zach Hill or my friend Andrew Prosser, in which case I know they're not coming back and I should probably do something else.
And that is kind of an important note, kind of along the level 1 lines of identifying the most powerful cards in the cube. If you want to do something fun that has a good shot of winning, you don't have to take the best card in the pack, but it's a good idea to take one of the 3 best cards in the pack. Sure. So, taking a Thoughtseize over really just kind of a range of blue cards. Thoughtseize is going to be actually one of the better cards in a cube, certainly one of the better black cards, but it's easy to imagine. Let's take your classic cube, for example. I'm going to take Mana Drain over Thoughtseize every time. However, if you don't want to play Mana Drain for whatever reason, like, sure, I've been playing the blue deck too much. Let's jam this Thoughtseize. It's pretty bad in terms of win equity. I think in that example, you're passing the literal best card in the cube, but Thoughtseize is pretty strong.
Yeah, Thoughtseize is very strong. It's something that I really like. Mana Drain certainly. I still haven't decided if it's going to stay in my cube. Honestly, it's especially after looking at the stats, it was a little higher than I wanted it to be. But yeah, I would say there's a range of cards that I could take over Thoughtseize in my cube, but Thoughtseize itself is defensible. I would say an overwhelming majority of cards in a lot of different colors are going to be better than, say, Inquisition or Duress, but I have picked Inquisition or Duress in packs where I believe a black 1-drop is going to wheel, which is also that's a point for fun, but it is also a point for winning for those who care. The number one lesson that I try and teach for at least retail limited, and it really ports over well to cube, is you like to think there's some objective rank order at pack one, pick one, because, what else could you do, right? Like, you have no card in your pool yet. But the fact of the matter is, maybe that exists, but let's say you have, I'm not even going to give examples. It's easier with letters. Let's say we have card A, card B, and card C, and A is better than B and B is better than C. That can all be true, but B plus C might be better than A. Mm-hmm. So if C is actually not that great of a card and you think it's going to wheel, you can take B and it can be actually correct in terms of win equity to take B because you're going to get C. And that's sort of, I would argue that the Duress into Gravecrawler wheeling is probably not the highest win equity play, but both of those cards is certainly a higher equity than just the individual Duress. And that is a great way of making a decision to win. I feel spiky, right? When I go, I'm going to take this card and this other card is going to come back and I'm going to have a great deck. I know what my deck's going to do. It's going to be a black aggro deck. There's going to be hand disruption, a low curve. Maybe I'll even get the contamination in my cube and make people's lives miserable. That sort of scratches all the itches. I feel like I'm playing to win, but I'm also doing something that not everybody does that I find fun.
Yeah, a nice example of this sort of thing from the vintage cube on Magic Online is, let's say you have a good blue card, maybe a very good blue card, not power. The example I'm going to use is Counterspell, which I think is premium in vintage cube. And there's Counterspell, and maybe there's another fine blue card. We won't get into that, but you're looking at Counterspell, and the pack has Usher of the Fallen, Figure of Destiny, and Intrepid Adversary. And when it comes to 3-0ing very easily, the best equipped deck to do that, in my experience, is Mono Blue Broken. And the way to end up in that deck is just to take the blue card regardless and hard force. However, this also relies on other people not being in blue, which is kind of rare, and you have to be lucky to end up there. In terms of win equity, it makes a ton of sense to take any of those 3 white creatures, whichever you deem the best. Personally, I would take Figure of Destiny of that lot because it's open to red or white. However, You can make an argument for either of the other white creatures, because the important part is that we're trying to get 2 relevant cards out of this pack. In fact, 2 quite good cards. We have 2 1-drops, and then Intrepid Adversary, which is like a 2-drop or your scalable endgame card. So you get 2 quite premium cards for the white deck if you take that approach to this pack.
Exactly. And I mean, this really does come back to sort of the, what we're trying to talk about here related to know the cube, right? When you're trying to understand, both how to win, but also how to have fun, you need to understand the different paths that you can take, the different decks that you can draft, the different scenarios that you can sort of conjure and figure out that you're going to win with or that you're going to have fun with. And that requires sort of, being able to predict what might happen. For example, you've drafted Magic Online cube quite a lot. And it seems to be that in that environment, people shy further away from the aggro decks than in, when I definitely run my cube personally with, 8 people. And so you're more likely to wheel those cards, and knowing that is good. But for more complicated decks, like, mono white exists. But for example, Storm has a bunch of different perturbations on that cube. One of the ones that a lot of people don't really know about is Reanimator Storm, that you can literally only ever do if you have Grizzlebrand. But if you do have Grizzlebrand, you can draft a reanimate deck, like a reanimator deck where it's literally your only reanimation target, and you're not actually a reanimator deck. It's just the best draw 7 that's ever been printed, and you will win the turn that you put it on the battlefield, no matter what. And that's a super fun deck to draft, but most people probably don't even know it exists.
Mm-hmm. I love that deck. For a while, I would claim that my favorite combo in Vintage Cube was land, Lion's Eye Diamond, discard on Burial Rites and Gristlebrand, flashback on Burial Rites.
Oh yeah, I have won turn 1 on Magic Online Vintage Cube doing that. It was my greatest moment on Magic Online's Vintage Cube for sure.
Yeah, that's a good point, is knowing about these archetypes. Like Storm Reanimator, it might sound like kind of a joke to some players. And if I told you that there was a legacy deck based on this that people refer to colloquially as Tin Fins, you might still think is a joke, because that's a very stupid deck name. However, having Gristlebrand in your Storm deck, you do open up these really interesting and powerful avenues to win, like Dark Ritual plus some other fast mana, maybe Grim Monolith, and just like powering out Gristlebrand. It turns out that wins a lot of games too. And just like the natural mana acceleration from the rituals or the mana rocks or whatever that go into your Storm deck just tend to play well with Gristlebrand. So knowing that option is available to you, like pack 1, pick 1, I'm looking for something pretty powerful to pass a Gristlebrand.
Yep. And also like knowing, when I'm drafting Storm, like I know that is the most fun Storm deck for me. Like I enjoy Storm, but I know I will probably have more fun going 2-1 with a Reanimator Storm deck than I will going 3-0 with a, normal Yawgmoth's Will style. Maybe the Yawgmoth's Will is also part of the Grizzle Storm deck, but it'll still be less fun for me. Knowing that, I will speculate on, I don't have the Grizzlebrand yet, but I am going towards a Storm route, and I will take an Exhume at pack 1, pick 9 or whatever. I will, take Shallow Grave. Shallow Grave is a really important one for that, because you actually get the additional draw 7 because you get to attack with the Grizzlebrand once.
I think speculative picks are a really good thing to highlight if we're talking about leaving yourself open to have a powerful deck that does something that you like. If you get to the back end of a pack and like, here's a card I'll definitely play. It's a creature with power and toughness in my colors, versus your example of Exhume, where I'm leaving myself open to have this Reanimator sort of thing. You should try to take the thing that makes something joyful work. When it comes to that card that you could play, certainly if we're talking about like pack 1, pick 9, trust yourself to get enough playables. Yep. Like hedge on doing the powerful, cool thing. If you do that enough times, at least one of them is going to work. And as long as you're drafting the front of the pack towards a coherent deck, you won't end up shy on playables. You don't need 15 live cards in your sideboard. And it tends to be more fun when you do make something kind of wacky and powerful work anyway. And that's maybe louder in Vintage Cube than it is in other cubes, when there's a lot more pressure to do something kind of really powerful. But I do a lot of speculative picking in the Vintage Cube, where it's like, my current deck would definitely not play this Mystical Tutor, but I'll sure feel stupid if Time Walk shows up and I didn't take it.
Yeah. And I mean, related to other cubes, right? Like, I think that's something to tie in. Vintage Cube is almost its own space. We're just thinking about it because it's been online for a little while, and it's, generally it's closer to my classic cube. So I often think about Vintage Cube. But understanding the cubes that you end up drafting, whatever the cube you have, your friend has, and the different things inside it that you'll enjoy the most. Like, I know for a fact, you can't pay me to play a black white life gain deck. I don't care if it's right for my seat. It's not. I'm not going to sit down and draft a pauper cube and get fed great black and white cards. Like, if I get fed great black and white cards and there's a black and white life gain theme, I'm going to try and figure out a non-life gain Orzhov deck. And maybe that ends up not winning as much, but it'll be more fun for me for sure. The other thing that, like, I personally enjoy as a cube designer myself with drafting other cubes that are often not sort of vintage level cube is trying to see sort of the vision of the owner and the different puzzles that they've set. I'll often said this, at least on Twitter, I don't think on the podcast yet, but whenever I draft somebody's cube for the first time, I usually ask them, is there something that you've seeded or that you've put into this cube that you haven't seen anybody do yet, or you really want to succeed, but you're not sure how it would work? Almost every cube designer has given me like a salient answer that, like, is something that they've been thinking about, that they've been trying to support. They've been trying to figure out, maybe they haven't figured it out fully yet. So it's not a fully supported archetype, but some cards are in there that they want to make work. And I found myself personally enjoy cube the most when I sit down with that information and then I say, okay, how do I navigate this draft? How do I try and solve this puzzle that's been laid out for me? And that can be super rewarding, both as just like a really nice puzzle for me to solve, a nice cognitive challenge, but also like the social experience of like going through my deck at the end of the draft with the owner of the cube and like seeing how it works. Like, even if I 0-3 in that scenario, or I 3-0, like, you learn something. And so I've always it's almost the thing that I probably enjoy the most when I'm drafting a cube that's not mine.
That leads to really good collaborative moments between two cube owners, two cube designers, where you either ask them explicitly or you see in the packs that you are trying to draft a certain archetype that seems to be supported. And then you have the conversation, whether your deck was successful or not. And you can point to the cards that were helpful to you, and maybe you have some ideas for similar cards, or just by you mentioning that, the cube owner will have some stuff that they were thinking about adding, and they'll think, great, I can reinforce it in this point. Or you can have some conversation about cards you didn't see that you missed, or maybe this archetype is kind of reliant on some powerful cards that other archetypes kind of gobble up. Just by trying to engage with a specific archetype that you know is there, you can definitely have some very interesting conversations. And I really enjoy that a lot too, when you just approach this cube and somebody has designed this thing and you're like, try my thing, try this thing out. And you say, okay, well, this is how it worked for me. And those conversations are a lot more fun than just wins and losses for me. I like that quite a lot.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, for me, one of the things that I miss the most about cubing, given the pandemic, it's not about playing with the cards. It's stuff like that. It really, like, the learning from people, being able to sort of like make decisions and end up either somebody puts a smile on my face, I put a smile on somebody else's face, I learned something, somebody else learned something. It's really what cube is about for me. And so I've made a habit to try and always answer that question. Ask that question. And it's always, I think it's led to the one time I've had fun going 0-3.
What was the deck?
It was like a red-white tokens deck kind of thing. It was if I'm remembering correctly, it was like a peasant cube that was trying to push, what's the like it's like a 2-mana enchantment that whenever a creature enters the battlefield, an opponent takes a damage, kind of like mini Perforos.
Oh, so like impact tremors, right? So there was like this attempt to like intersect this sort of like combo oriented but aggressive red-white deck. This was a while ago, so I think the tools for something like that are much better now. Like heroic reinforcements didn't exist
yet. And I think part of the issue that I had, I don't think the deck itself couldn't exist. I think that the red and the white aggressive creatures that were like already in the cube didn't lend itself to that kind of strategy. So at the time, it was just a little bit more sporadic and not as cohesive of a deck as you would get, right? Like normally when something like that's expected, your 2-drops make tokens, right? And you don't end up playing your, Gorehouse Chainwalkers. Am I even pronouncing that right? Maybe, but sort of like I was, right? So it was like a red-white aggro deck. So the mana wasn't great. I was trying to push these like token enchantments, but almost all of them in that deck ended up being worse than another 2-drop that would just deal more damage. And so it fell a little bit on its face, but it was really interesting to sort of pursue. I don't know if that, archetype got cut or if it got pushed a little bit more. I think there was there are some really interesting white cards that can help make tokens in sort of lower powered environments, especially through like there's a whole suite of white bears that like can intersect with a flicker theme because they enter the battlefield and you return another creature and they can return token makers and stuff, as well as they can like return themselves and still ping with the impact tremors and stuff like that.
Sure.
So there's a lot of like interesting nuance to it, but I definitely recall the deck what I tried to do ended up being just like, it didn't get there. Right.
Right. Yeah. I also like to try to carve out a new space in my own cube. I try to draft a deck that I don't think is there, whether it be something kind of established, do nothing Azorius control, or the example that I really enjoyed, something that doesn't exist anywhere. One time in the Spooky Cube, I drafted like Young Pyromancer, Eternal Witness, and I think like Sword Splash or something like that, where like I somehow ended up in a seat where I thought, I wonder if I could draft a Naya Spells deck. And it was really bad. Yeah. Sometimes you like draft a deck and you think, oh, that was kind of cool. I can put some stuff in to make this work. Naya Spells, not a supported archetype. We did not work harder on that one from there. And in fact, maybe moved further away from it.
No, although I could see your Tempo Tubert actually yielding like a reasonable Naya Spells deck.
We are getting kind of more stuff. Yeah, Clarion Spirit didn't exist at that time. That pushes you a little bit more in that direction. Monk of the Open Hand can be good for that sort of thing.
There's the other one too. There's the light, whatever, the one that pumps your whole team whenever you cast or copy a spell.
Oh, I love that card. Yeah. Leonin Light Scribe.
Yep.
Yeah, maybe it's time for Naya Spells. And yeah, just exploring new archetypes. I also like when I play somebody else's cube, just kind of explore a bunch of different color pairs just to see. And this is actually one of the really positive notes I had about your classic cube on Magic Online. Like it was actually fun to go into green and white, which is not common for me in cubes. I kind of ran the range. I also drafted in your classic cube like a Jund version of Persist combo. And I really like just having kind of an archetype in a selection of colors that is kind of unconventional. That's really fun for me.
Yeah, and it's nice to have, different paths to explore. One of the things that I mentioned before, right, with the, I accidentally took infinite turns. Well, that's pretty cool. And I think being able to sort of siege your cube in ways that have stuff like that. One of my favorite infinite turn stories was I think I've told this on the podcast before, although I told it, it's happened many times. I think I told it with respect to Fae of Wishes, but the first time that I was drafting, and I was really worried about winning the game. I was drafting like a blue-white deck. I didn't really have any creatures. I had like pretty good mana and I had like a Nexus of Fate, but like I didn't have like, planeswalkers that were making creatures in white. I didn't have like, sure, I could cast this Nexus of Fate, but what was I doing with it? And like, I opened my pack 3 and I almost missed it. But there was an Oath of Druids. And like that actually, like it was not intended interaction, but I ended up either going 2-1 or 3-0, I don't remember, with a Bant control deck that's win condition was play Oath of Druids, mill my deck, take infinite turns with Nexus of Fate, and it didn't matter if whatever I had. And so like since then, that deck is super fun. It's showed up and done well in my cube multiple times. I think I've 3-0'd with it twice. The most memorable one was the story that I told about Fae of Wishes, where I didn't even have to play the Oath in my deck because I played Fae of Wishes in my deck, which could always fetch the Oath, and Fae of Wishes, if it fetched the Oath, was not in my deck, which meant that Oath would mill my whole deck, which also meant that I had Fae of Wishes in the Adventure Zone, so I could have a flyer to attack 20 times while I took infinite turns, which was awesome. Yeah. But those like small time, like that's literally like the existence of Nexus of Fate, which you can already play in your cube, and Oath of Druids, which you can already play in your cube, together spawns like a completely novel new archetype that has never existed in any constructed format, that you have to see those cards in a draft in a scenario and realize, wait a second, I can do a thing. Like that's so exciting.
Definitely.
And that's so fun to me. You know, the most fun that I've ever had in cube is like having those aha moments in the middle of a draft and getting all giddy about it.
I'm going to pivot pretty hard and tell the story of the worst cube deck I've ever seen. This was a vintage cube deck sometime in the last year before they removed Wildfire and Burning of Xinyi. And this is to highlight a point because we're talking about playing with Oath of Druids, Nexus of Fate. Even if these aren't necessarily the most powerful cards in the pack you saw, these are all very powerful cards.
Yeah.
And, I talk about playing Jund Persist combo. That deck benefited a lot from playing Daretti Genius Iconoclast and Grist the Hunger Tide, just making sure that I was playing the very powerful cards that my colors could support. And I had kind of a coherent sacrifice shell on top of the combo. The worst cube deck I've ever seen was a deck that was redundant in all the wrong places, bad fundamentals, very few, if any, powerful cards. What it was a Naya deck that played Armageddon, Ravages of War, Wildfire, and Burning of Xinyi. Just happened that they all came to the deck. I don't think any of them were picked very highly, but they all ended up being played in the deck. And just think about what has to happen in a game of Magic that you're going to cast Armageddon twice. What happens in a game of Magic that you're going to cast Burning of Xinyi and Wildfire? And then this also goes like the other way, like these two cards, Armageddon and Wildfire, you're not playing those in the same game either. So you just have like these 4 cards you're going to want at most one of. So really bad fundamentals. None of these have any ability to actually win the game. Armageddon is good at closing in your aggressive deck if you were able to get at least a little bit ahead and then destroy the mana sources so you can stay just a little bit ahead. Your 3-drop is currently the King of the Hill, and now only 1-drops can be cast. You're probably going to be doing pretty well. If your plan is Armageddon, look at my hand of Wildfire, Ravages of War, that plan sucks. So you want to make sure that you are grabbing some powerful cards, some cards that at least complement each other, that aren't just rancid in conjunction. Like the idea of having 2 Armageddons in the same deck. Like I know there's an era in constructed Magic. Sure, you would play 4 was your best card. That's very different than a cube deck playing 2 copies of Armageddon. I would say that it's almost never correct to do that. Maybe sometimes.
I'd say the main time it's correct, right, is sort of exactly to like in, let's say years ago when I think like Wildfire was like an interesting thing that you could, I personally don't think Wildfire gets there anymore. But I do think that like having 2 copies of a card that like is your plan makes sense. But once you go like, again, you only need 1 of it. Once you go like more of it, and you could easily shave 1 if you got a tutor.
Yeah, you have to identify both that the Armageddon is going to be your haymaker. Your deck is just so set up to curve out into Armageddon in a way where if you do it, you should win. And probably also that you're bad at interacting in any other way.
Yeah, and this is where like you read Armageddon and you read Wildfire, and you could like on those readings, you could see them as like pushing towards a similar plan, but they really don't, right? Like the kind of point of Wildfire is you're going to fall behind, but you're going to cast it and catch up, either because you have mana rocks so that you can then cast more expensive things after, or you have a planeswalker and they have creatures. Whereas Armageddon is really saying like, no. You need to already be ahead when you are casting this.
Mm-hmm. So a friend said, I'm going to play a bunch of Wildfires and a bunch of Armageddons. It's going to be sweet. It wasn't sweet. It was very funny. It was incredibly funny, but I don't think it was sweet, and it was a very weak deck.
Yeah.
Do you have any kind of other notes here on just kind of knowing the cube and going about drafting something coherent, even if we are not doing the most powerful thing, if we're biasing towards what we like?
No, I mean, I really think that we touched all of the notes here. I'll say that, it's important to sort of step back. We've mentioned this a little bit and understand that like cube is filled with lots of powerful cards, and you can still take a very strong one without taking the best one and having that be correct for you, right? Drafting with preferences is a thing. And, following, if you're going to have more fun, you're also probably going to play better. If you know that you love aggro decks and are not a fan of control decks, if I gave you an 8 out of 10 aggro deck or a 9 out of 10 control deck, what are you going to perform better with? It's probably the aggro deck. Mm-hmm. So even then, leaning away from just the best card and still taking a good card that has a plan that you can pursue in the cube that you're going to have fun with, I mean, that's all you need.
Definitely makes a lot of sense to me. So those are kind of some broad notes on knowing the cube, understanding, having some good fundamentals as you approach the draft. We're going to take another break, and we'll be back to talk about drafting decks that you love drafting and playing. We'll be right back.
Look, you're listening to the 540 podcast. I know you have cubes and new ideas and cards on the side you'd love to turn into something new and shiny. If you're looking to sell your Magic the Gathering cards, it's never been easier. Visit starcitygames.com/sell with a 30% store credit bonus and the fastest turnaround time in the industry. There's no reason to sell to anybody else. Enjoy 4 convenient ways to sell. Check out our buy list. Ship your cards to us. You can come to us, but also if you have over 500,000 cards you're looking to sell or own a store and want to sell off that bulk, we'll come to you. Go to starcitygames.com/sell now for more information.
All right, welcome back, everybody. We've talked about how to know what's going on in the cube, how to approach drafting a deck with good fundamentals, but now it's time to actually go into kind of the finer details. How do I end up drafting a deck I'm really going to enjoy playing? For me, a super important note is to have an idea of a deck that I want to draft. When I'm picking my pack 1, pick 1, and as I solidify what's going on in my pick 2 and my pick 3, the whole time I'm thinking about exactly what the deck I am trying to draft does. When it comes to the Magic Online Vintage Cube, I'm already thinking, what's going on with the mana situation? What are people passing lands? Do I think I could realistically be 2 or 3 colors? Will I just try to have to look out to see what's going to be open for that? Am I trying to be a specific kind of combo deck, an aggressive deck, a controlling deck, and then allowing myself to pivot on the kind of easy access one? A control deck can support Tinker if you get a little bit of an artifact package, but you couldn't necessarily support something like Kuldotha Forge Master. Whereas if on the other side of things, if you open up on Tolarian Academy, you can be just kind of a big artifact deck. And then that can certainly trickle in some controlling elements. You're going to play Cryptic Command, Counterspell, whatever in that deck. So I kind of always have an idea of what the deck I'm trying to draft looks like. And the note that we mentioned in the previous section about hedging on picks later in the pack, knowing what the deck you're trying to draft looks like really informs those hedges. I use the example of seeing a Mystical Tutor late. If I'm drafting a deck where there's a number of powerful instants and sorceries I could play, that control deck that maybe would play Tinker is obviously looking for Ancestral Recall and Time Walk. And sure, your deck's going to be pretty good if it has one or both of those cards in it. But that doesn't mean that it's silly to think about maybe having them. Yeah, it's actually quite smart to maximize your percentage to get the best version of your deck. Certainly over playing some like Solemn Simulacrum that you may or may not play in your deck. No disrespect to Solemn Simulacrum. It's just fallen off quite a lot in recent years.
Yeah, this is actually one of the most important notes in just general, like optimal draft navigation strategy, whether we're talking about Cube or Retail Limited. Actually, what I think is the best article I've ever written on StarCityGames.com. It's called From Picks to Paths. And it's about this. It's about, most people when they're drafting, they're looking at the cards they've drafted so far to inform their decision. But actually, what informs your decision way more than that is the cards you expect to draft in the future. There's usually more of them. Pack 1, pick 5, you have 40 more cards you have 5 cards that are determining, this is what I'm going to draft. But actually, you have 40 more picks left. And that also informs it. So getting in the habit of like closing your eyes, imagining what your deck is going to look like, what you want your deck to look like, what an optimal version of your deck looks like, what different kinds of perturbations of that strategy there that you can draft. It lets you hedge in the right way. It lets you make the right picks. It also lets you, build as you go and sculpt a deck that's going to be great and that you're going to also enjoy, to stay within the theme of this podcast.
Definitely. And there's also some really specific cards that you can be looking for. We're not just talking about leave yourself open to maximize time walk. Like, okay, I'll get that sometimes, I guess. But there are a number of cards that are very powerful in the decks that they go into and the archetypes that they go into that you can expect to get late in the draft, deep in a pack, if you carve out your lane properly. It's currently not in the Vintage Cube. I hope it returns. But a good example of this for me is Leovold. Emissary of Trust, is that the card's name?
Yeah, it's the correct name.
Yeah, so Leovold costs blue, black, green, 3/3, some really good text. That casting cost is incredibly prohibitive. However, the card is good enough. It does a lot of things for attrition games, just turning off cantrips in a format that really incentivizes other players to be drawing extra cards a turn. And then has some combinations, like it plays really well if you can make it work with Time Twister. You have that kind of combo finish as well. But Leovold is just this really good card for a Sultai deck that once you have scooped up Tropical Island, Underground Sea, and these are cards that maybe you first picked them, but at least some of them were passed to you, and the other players see what's going on. They think, oh, somebody's scooping up all the Sultai lands. Like, there's no way that I can be playing green, black, and blue. You get to the point where nobody else at the table is going to open up Leovold and be excited about it. So that's going to make its way back to you. Omnath, Locus of Creation, 4-color card. That one shows up in a lot of the digital cubes now. If you're just scooping up all the non-black dual lands, if an Omnath shows up in the draft later, very good chance that card makes its way to you. Niv Mizzet Reborn, the 5-color card. I'm not about it. A lot of people really are. If you're just scooping up all the dual lands, if a Niv Mizzet shows up, good chance it makes its way to you. In the arena cubes, I really like scooping up a bunch of non-basic lands so that Golos and/or Fields of the Dead are likely to make it to me late. And just really kind of carving out your seat in a way where it stops making sense for the other players to be interested in the cards that you really want. And then you start to get more real prizes late in the draft.
Yeah, and you get to, because you can then expect to get them, you get to draft differently on the way there too, right? Like maybe, in this Sultai scenario, right? You've picked up a bunch of duels. You really, it's the middle of pack 2. Or maybe let's say mid early, because it probably won't be in the middle of pack 2, but you aren't currently, your deck currently doesn't look like it would really be interested in a Time Twister. It would be like kind of a draw card, but it's generally like pretty overrated if you're not doing broken things with it. But you could still take it over like the random Doomblade that's probably going to end up in your sideboard, because you know what? If Leovold's opened, you'll get it. And then you compare those two cards and win the game with that.
Yep, absolutely. And then also having an idea of what your deck's going to look like, that's going to inform, even if the pack is between kind of two interactive cards. You mentioned there's a Doomblade in the pack. Maybe there's a Doomblade and a Mana Leak. Or like you have some white card, Gideon Ally of Zendikar, Teferi Time Raveler, Teferi Hero of Dominaria. Just some good white planeswalker that you intend to play in a blue-white control deck. You want to have an answer to the question before it's asked you. If you see a pack that has Wrath of God and Mana Leak, if you map out what you want your deck to look like before we make these decisions, you're not asking that question in the moment. If you ask yourself that question in the moment, you run the risk of waffling and kind of mixing heuristics. It's really funny to watch people draft like together collaboratively. And to an extent, if you have some really smart people, some people that are good at Magic working together, you can solve some difficult problems, but you can also have too many cooks in the kitchen and just end up in a situation where you make similar decisions opposite ways at different times and just do something that is kind of contradictory. It's really important. It doesn't matter what your answer is. If you would take the Wrath of God or the Mana Leak, it just matters that you have an answer and you establish heuristic and you stick to it. I'm going to say for me, it's the Mana Leak and it's not close to being close, but like for some people, it is the Wrath of God.
Yeah, and it depends on a lot, right? Like if you already have like a miscalc and a counterspell, then but you don't have a Wrath, maybe it's the Wrath. I mean, I think what you said really rings home in the sense that I do believe you take two of the best drafters in the world and you have them alternate picks, and you take like somebody that's on the tier below but still really good and have them just draft by themselves. The tier below is going to end up with a better deck, and it's just. There's this you're trying to push towards navigate towards a path that ends up with the best deck. And so different people approach problems like this differently. I've said sort of drafting with preferences, different strokes for different folks. Like what may be correct for one person is incorrect for another. And as long as you're sort of consistent with what is correct for you, you end up with something better than if two people were going to be sort of oscillating on that. So I really like that note.
Yeah, if you had me alternating picks with somebody who really liked Splinter Twin, you would have a deck that had Pestermite, Deceiver Exarch, no combo pieces, and then like a Tezzeret the Seeker with no artifacts to untap. That like past Grim Monolith. It would just be all over the place. Yeah, knowing what your preferences are and having a deck that you're intentionally drafting, I think goes a very long way. Yeah, just testing your theory, like thinking, okay, this is the deck I want to draft. When I get it, I think it's good. How good is it? That's going to be important to know. Like you can really glean some very specific information, assuming you are able to draft approximately the deck you want to draft. And it also just goes a long way into just having something coherent that works and not accidentally waffling. And you might not notice, if you're not thinking intentionally about it, making these draft picks that kind of contradict each other. But going forward, if you haven't been thinking about this kind of thing, you start thinking about it, or you watch other people draft, you will really start to see some decks that just like have two decisions in the draft that seemingly, if both were made the same way, would lead to a great deck, one way or the other. But when you flip the switch and you go both directions, you have kind of an incoherent nonsense deck.
Yeah, absolutely. The most common way you see that, at least this is probably true for just all draft, has to do with splashing, right? Like when you're given the option to take like, let's say you're drafting like a red green deck and you have some Rakdos strong gold card. If you decide that you're splashing, you take the land that will produce, like let's say a City of Brass. If you decide that you're not, you're taking like a good, red 2-drop or whatever. And those are like both coherent decisions as long as you're correct with whichever deck you are. But if you end up, passing the land and splashing, that's bad. And if you end up taking the land and not splashing, that's also bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's actually something that's really compounded. I got Supreme Draft on the brain, but you only get 36 picks in Supreme Draft as opposed to the usual 45.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, you do 18 packs and get 2 cards from every pack. And blue is obviously the best color in Vintage Cube, and you're going to get a pick of many of the best blue cards. So it's hard to justify not being blue. And given that you're taking a Mox over literally anything, and a Soul Ring and a Mana Crypt, all that sort of stuff over literally anything, you can have a second color, sometimes a third color if things fall right. But you can't do this thing where you take Oko, Teferi, Time Raveler, and Underground Sea. Like that deck, invariably, just by the number of cards you're going to see, its mana is going to fail, or it's going to be shy on playables, trying to only play castable spells.
Right. You can do it if you're passing the Moxen.
yeah. You have to sacrifice something significant to make this all work. Where, it's kind of a bad example as it pertains back to traditional booster draft, because like if you keep seeing those cards coming, you do want to take them all because you will have those 9 additional cards to make something good work. And like, if you have Oko in your deck and Teferi Time Raveler is on the sideboard, or vice versa, like at least you're playing those good cards. Where the numbers game in Supreme Draft actually makes it so like just your deck ends up shy playables, and you don't have a sideboard or anything to do about it.
Yeah, I mean, the real lesson there is know your context. Sure, it doesn't port over to like normal 3 packs of 15 because that exact lesson may not be there. But, they're 2 very different contexts, very different formats, and sort of that guides everything, right? So the real thing to take away from here, right, is, know yourself, right? Know what you enjoy, what you're good at, so that you can lean into those 2 things to have a good time and win. Know the cube so that you actually can, pave yourself that lane, carve yourself that lane, imagine what your deck looks like and go towards it. I feel like there's a third thing, that I was gonna say, but it's gone now. It's just complete poof. I don't know if, but the first 2 things I said I thought were pretty good.
Yeah, those are pretty. Know yourself, know the cube. That'll get you pretty far. Know the deck you're trying to draft. Can I toss that in? That might not be what you were going for.
No, I feel like it was something about like the context. I was talking about the difference in format context. But I guess that's in the cube. I'm okay with just taking the L and saying.
I was kind of waiting for you to finish up, and I was going to say something like "really well said" and wrap up the show. But now we have this, so you're welcome, everybody. This is, I guess, not a live recording, but all the same, we're not going to fix this.
No, that's okay. I'll listen to it again when it goes live to torture myself.
Yeah, and maybe you'll remember what you're going to say.
Maybe. Recently, actually, this was kind of funny. I was talking to my grandma. Apparently, when I was like 10, I showed her some text-based game on the internet, and she asked me what the name of it was, which, of course, I had no clue, right? Like, that was, 20 years ago, whatever. And I was hanging out with my partner, watching a TV show, and I like didn't even control my body. I just like stood up and yelled text twist. This was like 10 days after this conversation, but apparently my brain had been working it in the back. And I was right. I looked it up and it was the game.
Oh, that is nice. All right. Know yourself, know the cube. Try to remember what the third thing was, but you have those 2, you'll get pretty far. Are there any other notes you want to touch on the broad topic of joyful cubing, or anything else that we've discussed today before we close the show?
Yeah, there's really one important one. Have fun.
Love it. Yeah, definitely. I mentioned my bias about winning being very important to me, but having fun is the most important thing. That's what cube is. It's about self-expression and having a good time. And if people aren't having a good time, that sounds like a bad time.
It does sound like a bad time.
That's not how we need to spend our recreational time. We only get so much of it.
Yeah, I wish we got more, but...
Yeah, just how it is. But that is going to do it for our discussion on joyful drafting. Hopefully, you found something that could maybe refine your approach to drafting cube, or at least you enjoyed the listen. You stuck with us to the end, and for that, we do really appreciate you. And we would also really appreciate if you could subscribe to the 540 wherever you listen to your podcast. I am Ryan Overturf. You can find me at Ryan Overdrive on Twitter. You can find my articles weekly on StarCityGames.com about most things cube. Ryan Saxe, where can we find you?
Hey y'all, I'm Ryan Saxe. You can find me at RC Saxe on Twitter. I usually write weekly for StarCityGames.com, but at the moment that's sort of on hiatus until the next limited environment comes out, which would be, I think, Kamigawa and Neon Dynasty. Is that the right one?
That's the one.
Yeah, so when that comes out, you can expect, and probably before, you can expect my limited articles there. Otherwise, if you're looking for my content, check me out on Twitter. I'm working on some Magic drafting algorithms. Just hit Mythic with it, so that's pretty exciting, and I will continue to be pushing that forward.
Yeah, definitely check that out. That's a really cool project. Happy to see that you made it to Mythic, and I'm kind of excited to watch the evolution of that.
Yeah, I was pretty stoked.
Yeah, definitely check that out. Thank you so much again for listening, and we will see you next week.